welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a collection of short stories as well as some other writing that I found absolutely beautiful. This was a really stunning piece of writing. So hello, welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
My name's Rees Gardner, and I've written the book Delinquents and Other Escape Attempts, which is linked short stories about the fictional town of Westinghouse, Ohio.
It is such a gorgeous collection, and I really appreciate the way that the stories are interlinked. Could you talk a little bit about your career as a writer and what led you to this project?
So my career as a writer, really, it seems like it started within the last 5 years, but I've been writing for 15 years or so, a little more than that probably, really striving to be a writer for about the last 10 years. So these stories actually came from originally like a manuscript that I had written as one of those NaNoWriMo projects. And I really wanted to discuss living in the Rust Belt, addiction, and recovery, just because I had read a lot of books about those subjects, but nothing that really mirrored my experience. So it was the kind of thing where I'd worked on that for years, but never felt like, I guess, so I am a recovered addict. So I was trying to write this story of basically what I was living at the time. And I don't think I had the distance then with that manuscript. So I set that aside, worked on quite a few other short stories, was able to get into an MFA program at Bowling Green State University, where I was kind of pushed more to publish than I had ever been before. So I worked on a lot of flash fiction, and that was kind of my introduction to publishing. I was able to get a few pieces published in some great journals, which then kind of looped me into this writing community. And I was like, oh, this is what it's all about. It's not about writing a bestseller, it's about being part of this literary community, this great group of people. So I would say that was about 5 years ago, and that's when I started working on the stories that make up Delinquents. I had a teacher who got me interested in Sam Lipsyte a lot. And I had written one book of poetry back in 2019. It was published, called So Marvelously Far. And she said, well, why are you trying to write this straightforward, Hemingway-esque fiction? She's like, you're a poet, lean into the language. And that really opened up a lot of doors then for, I guess, finding my voice as a writer. So yeah, I guess I have written other things and had a few things published, but the stories and Delinquents are really, I think, where my voice is as a writer. I really found my penchant for language, and that's really what drives my writing now.
Super interesting. Yeah, because one of my questions actually is about poetry and how your experience as a poet shaped these stories. There are some that do feel like they are leaning into poetry more than straightforward prose, especially toward the middle. There's short pieces entitled Recovery and Relapse, and it's very rhythmic and all these short sections presented. And yeah, I was wondering if it was, I mean, you kind of answered that a little bit, if it was conceived as poetry in a straightforward way, or if it just sort of became that as it evolved.
I guess a lot of it was exploration while I was working on these pieces. The first piece I wrote is actually the last piece in the book, Drug Magic, the first piece for this collection. And I tried to approach it kind of as straightforward prose, but as I worked on other pieces in the collection, I was thinking about space and how something's laid out on the page. And I loved, my first book of poetry was all sonnets. And I love kind of that block layout with all this white space around it in a sonnet. And yeah, I was just thinking about that a lot. Why aren't pieces of fiction playing with space in this way? So there are two pieces, I think, mainly, one called Orange Pill, Yellow Wrangler, and one called Spitbacks that use that space in different ways. And a lot of it was kind of just play. I was like, I'm not gonna constrain myself to a certain form, a certain paragraph length or sentence length. I believe originally they didn't have any kind of punctuation in them either. I kind of just let myself go. I wasn't constraining myself anymore to any certain style. that Spitbacks piece, the one with the titles like recovery and
Mm.
addiction, was interesting because I had one professor actually tell me, oh, this isn't publishable. Like, no journal can publish this because of the way it's spaced out. And I was like, well, I don't care. Like, I feel like this is the way it has to be spaced out. And luckily, my publisher, Kevin Breen, when I said I want each of these sections on a separate page, he was like, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense, and went right along with it. So
I really love the way that those spaces do create rhythm for the piece. And I am curious about structure and rhythm and sort of if that was something that you also evolved as you wrote. I'm really curious, I guess, in particular, about whether it started as interconnected stories or if that sort of emerged as you wrote. And at what point did Westinghouse evolve as the connecting device?
So that's actually when it really got fun for me to write these stories. I still felt like I was in this experimental page after I wrote the final story of the collection. And then I read this book by Sam Pink called The Ice Cream Man and Other Stories. And they were all stories about work. Each one would kind of revolved around someone doing one job. And I really enjoyed that. And I was like, I've done all these weird jobs. And talking to my partner too, I would always have like weird stories. Like I tell her weird anecdotes. Like, everyone, like in a beer and wine store, everyone farts in the cooler. It's just like it's just something that happens, but you wouldn't know that unless you worked there and walked in there after one of your employees walked in there. So then I went on to the story about a food truck worker. I was like, I'm gonna have one about a food truck worker. I want to write one about someone who works in a winery. And that's how they just started evolving. So I was gonna have these stories revolving around work. But then I started realizing that different characters and places were popping up in my different stories. And I was like, oh, well, actually, these all take place in the same town too. And then in my story about a winery, there's a character named Dunk, and I just couldn't stop thinking about him as I was working on the other stories. And finally, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna write his story. Like he definitely has a story. And then that evolved into this whole novella that as I was writing more, I realized, oh, this actually ties a lot of the other stories together as well. And kind of what happened with Westinghouse was I had that as a stand-in before in this failed novel that I wrote quite a while back. That was the name I called the town just so I didn't call it my hometown and offend anybody. But then I was like, oh, well, I think these stories take place in Westinghouse, Ohio. I kind of realized that. And yeah, I guess it just evolved from that, just these small realizations along the way. One interesting thing is I actually got a rejection on the book because I was told that the stories weren't connected enough.
Whoa.
And I think it was just a couple months later was when Kevin from Madrona accepted the book and said in our first talk, he said, now can we call these linked short stories? And that was the intent. At that point, I wasn't sure if I was like, what am I doing wrong here? But I think that idea that they are linked short stories then during editing allowed me to play around and throw in more connections between them too. So
Yeah, it seems like a very interesting organic process. You just sort of let the writing lead you where it led you, which is an exciting way to write, sounds like.
yeah. One other thing was when I was using drugs, I lived in the same town that I then left for 2 years, got clean, and then moved back to the same town. So Westinghouse, in a lot of ways, was the city that I experienced while I lived there, while I lived in Mansfield, which was a lot when I moved back. I was really experiencing a totally different city. I had new friends, I had new places that I went to. I didn't go to the same haunts that I used to go to when I was using. So as I wrote too, I kind of realized that Westinghouse is this town that my drug-addled mind built for myself. So I've kind of just been living with this town in my head for many years, and I think it really just came to life as I was writing the stories. I
Mm.
kind of discovered it again.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess jumping off of that, I would love if we could talk a little bit about, I guess, the representation of addiction and recovery and relapse. I read on your website that you've also studied media portrayals of addiction and recovery through various like theoretical lenses, which I think is super cool and interesting. I'm curious about how that, in addition to your own experiences, shaped the stories, particularly when it comes to populating the town. Because I think the stories do a great job of exploring the various drives for substance use and what people are, as the title says, escaping, their escape attempts, like, so could you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. So I was actually talking to Morgan Tulty a little bit about writing about addiction. And what I loved about his book was he wrote stories that talked about addiction that weren't about addiction. And kind of what I've come to, there are a lot of books about addiction, but they're about addiction. And I wanted to write something for me, like the book isn't about addiction to me. The book is about people's lives. And addiction is just this small segment of it. And I feel like it also is a great point of tension. So a lot of times in media, it's easy. You can just be like, oh, the character's an addict, and you already have this tension, you already have this interest built into the story. It's kind of like a cheat code almost for writing. So I wanted addiction to be there, but I wanted to show that these characters have full lives as well. So the characters that do use drugs or addiction as an escape attempt in my stories, I wanted them to use that as an escape attempt to get out of all these other things like bad relationships, abusive relationships, a podunk town, or growing up in a cult, or to kind of show that more. Because also, I feel like a lot of people look to books on addiction to find, or any media on addiction to find like the answer. Like, why do people get hooked on drugs? And for me at least, I don't think there is an answer. I still have never figured out why exactly I got hooked on drugs because I really was not raised that way. Took me a long time to even find access to drugs when I was a young kid. So I don't think there is an answer to why people get hooked on drugs. So I kind of thought, let's play around. Let's see how many of these different lives turn to drugs or turn away from drugs. And I also wanted to show that too, that there are these other escape attempts that people make to get out of a small town, like becoming, going to grad school or becoming an academic or just moving away, for example. So.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm glad you brought up the portrayals of academia too, because I am myself a failed academic. Not that I don't love libraries, but this wasn't where I intended to be. And I'm glad I ended up here. But there was another version of my life where I was in universities and stuff like that. And I did spend time adjuncting, and like sort of living that marginal academic life. Yeah, could you talk about that aspect a little bit too? There are characters who are academics and who are struggling against what modern academia has become.
Mhm. Yeah. So part of that was I was working on some of these stories while I was in grad school. So that was gonna kind of bleed through inevitably, I think. But I also went to grad school in Bowling Green in Ohio, which is a very small town, very inexpensive town too, but also just some brilliant people there. Another thing that I was thinking about a lot was that I've actually, even now, right now, I'm a manager of a beer and wine store, and one of my employees has a PhD. Another one has a master's in, I can't remember, some science, some kind of sciences. And I think a lot of people look at academia as just this certain route, and then you end up teaching and you kind of sit in your ivory tower looking down at everything. But my experience, especially in the Midwest, was there were all these very educated people, very artistic people who could debate with the greatest minds at any university, and they're working as a barista or as an auto mechanic or something, and they're still happy. They're still good people and still happy. But I guess another thing that I wanted to fight against is this idea of flyover country in the Midwest. It's kind of seen like, especially in like the very red states, like it's often seen as like kind of backwards. But in my hometown, there were a lot of writers and artists who are great writers and artists that I worked with and really encouraged me to become a writer. So I guess I kind of wanted to fight against all these stereotypes at the same time and show academics in places where you don't really see academics.
I love that because I think that a lot of people think that like the phrase working class academic is an anomaly or a paradox of some kind, but that exists.
Yeah.
Like we don't all end up in academia. And, even though I think universities are often portrayed as democratizing places or places for social mobility, like there's also gatekeeping there too. And it just presents another interesting tension for your stories.
Yeah.
I'd love if we could talk more about the characters. I think it's populated with such interesting people who are extremely easy to empathize with. And I'm wondering if you had any favorite characters to write and any most challenging characters to write.
Yeah. So this character I mentioned before, Dunk,
Mm.
was, I don't know, I mean, he might have more stories after this book. He was just really interesting to write, really fun to write. Basically, he was raised in a cult and then followed the Grateful Dead around for a while and worked a bunch of menial jobs and then realized he was old and he can't retire. He can't, so he doesn't know what he's going to do. And well, for one thing, I feel like that's a place where a lot of us are going to find ourselves eventually. Like, oh shoot, what are we going to do now? So I love like playing with that question through a character, but also he is just a character. Like he for a while he drinks a bunch of wine and parties all the time, even though he's getting up there in his years. So yeah, he was definitely one of the most fun characters to write and explore. As far as difficult characters, well, I do have like a few women in that are the main characters in stories, and that's, I wouldn't say it was as much difficult, but it required more. I had to get more beta readers for that, right? Because I just really didn't want to screw anything up. I didn't want to portray women through just my eyes alone. I wanted to get to understand these characters as they are. So I believe that Lifers, Locals, Hangers On story kind of features two women as the main characters, kind of questioning where they're at and who they're with at the time, which I don't think is like a problem that only a woman would have at all. I think everybody deals with that. So that was an easy part, but just seeing how they live in their world, especially in this town that's kind of podunk and filled with possibly sexist people. So I wanted to make sure I got that right. And luckily my partner has read that story several times in several different versions and corrected me. So
Cool. Yeah, I really loved that story. And I do love Dunk as a character. I think a lot of my favorite characters, like across media, are like a really interesting mixture of extremely fragile and extremely resilient, if that makes sense. Like that's a really interesting contradiction to play with. And I think that's like something that we see with a lot of these characters is that people who maybe appear as sort of fragile at first glance are incredibly resilient and complex and nuanced. And yeah, it's a really beautiful collection. I really enjoyed it.
thank you.
What is on the horizon for you? Are you writing at the moment?
Yeah, so recently over the last few weeks, I still do write pretty much almost every day, but not as much as I was before, just because I've been working a lot on promotion for the book. And I've also, well, my job actually, I was just working at this beer and wine store, and then I was offered pretty much free reign over the store. So I've been, which is great, but I've been having to hire new people and kind of staff this store. So I've been really busy with work, but I am working on this novel, which has Westinghouse kind of in the background. Westinghouse, Ohio is there, but it's about a guy in his 20s who leaves this cult where he's been living for 5 years, kind of escapes it and takes off on a road trip, but also realizes he doesn't know where to go. So he just drives west.
Mm.
And through that trip, he runs into like a lady who's now homeless who abandoned her daughter but is ready to win her daughter back. There's a group of anarchists that he runs into in a protest. So I just kind of wanted to explore like what would happen if what if you were gone throughout the whole pandemic, throughout all the, Black Lives Matter things, and then you come back into this world and you have to figure it all out from scratch, really.
Wow. Oh, that's super interesting. Oh, very cool. Yeah, that sounds very exciting. And if you want to come back and talk about that project when it is out in the world, that would be fabulous. Yeah, it sounds like, yeah, there's a lot on your plate, but it all sounds very exciting. And I hope that, your job too is like, I always find that working with the public is a really great source of story. Like just
Yeah.
talking to the
Yeah.
people who walk in and out of like being in the same place all day is just really great for generating interesting things. So
Yeah, I definitely have some new characters in mind now.
thank you so much for joining us and sharing your book with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Oh, thank you. Okay, listeners, it is now your turn. Please check out Delinquents and Other Escape Attempts. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So please go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for books. All right, it is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.